only thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live. Thanks for joining us today. Be sure and visit us online at wallbuilders.com and wallbuilderslive.com. Wealth of information there. Lots of great links, lots of great archive programs at WallBuilders Live. You can also check out our radio stations around the country carrying the program. You might be listening on podcast and would like to also listen in your car or at home on radio. We're on stations across the nation, and we'd love to be on one in your community if we're not already. So be sure and take the program, grab some links, and send it to those local stations and encourage them to pick up WallBuilders Live. All right, David, today we're going to dive into a founding father many people may not have heard of. So let's just kind of talk about some of our well-known, or maybe in your case, you've probably got some favorite founders that people never even may not even recognize the name.
Well, let me ask you, who's your favorite founder?
Oh, that's a tough call, man. Probably Patrick Henry. You've really made me fall in love with Benjamin Rush, though. I really like Benjamin Rush. So, I don't know if I can pick one.
You don't know if you can. All right, if you had to pick three, what three do you pick?
Okay, if I had to pick three, I would go Henry, Rush, and Washington.
There you go. That's good. I get asked that question a lot too. Who's your favorite founder? And I kind of have to say it on levels. I say, well, among the popular founding fathers that everybody knows, I go to Washington. He's just a great one. But there's a bunch of good founding fathers, like you said, Henry, and Henry's fairly well known. Rush is not well known, but I go to, I guess, those that would be lesser lights in today's culture, people that are not, they don't know that much about them. And there's a ton of good guys there. I mean, you got John Jay and John Witherspoon and James Wilson, and you got Benjamin Rush and Roger Sherman. And as you get down on that level, I tend to pick three or four of those guys. I love Roger Sherman. I love John Jay. I love Benjamin Rush. I love Witherspoon and Wilson. I mean, those are guys that I'm just really intrigued with because they had a huge impact. Nobody today really knows about it. But Roger Sherman is one of those guys that, he signed in 1774 the Articles of Association. He signed in 1776 the Declaration. He signed in 1777 the Articles of Confederation, in 1787 the U.S. Constitution, and in 1791 he's a framer of the Bill of Rights. He's the third most active member at the Constitutional Convention. He's the guy who gives us the bicameral system, House and Senate, where you balance the states voting with the people's voting, which leads to the Electoral College, where both states and people get a voice in choosing the president. I mean, you look at what he did. He's amazing. He was a professor of theology at Yale University. He was a judge. He was a shoe cobbler. He basically taught himself. He was a self-taught guy, brilliant guy, and nobody really knows that much about him. Now, I will say that one of the things that we have a lot of fun doing, every summer we have several groups of interns that come into WallBuilders. And by the way, if you're interested in going through the intern program at WallBuilders in the summer, 2-week programs, you can go to intern@wallbuilders.com and let us know you're interested, and we'll get back with you and let you have the details. But one of the things we do over those 2 weeks is in the afternoon, we put the interns actually in the library, in the actual handwritten documents of the founders, etc. And one of the things we typically do is say, we want you to take one of the 56 signers of the Declaration you have never heard about. You've never heard the name of this guy in your whole life, and do research him. Tell us what you find on him. And then on another day, we'll say, there's 55 guys at the Constitutional Convention. We want you to take one you've never heard of before and research them. And, there were 80 some odd generals in the Revolution, 17 major generals. We want you to take one you've never heard of and research them. And these kids come back, this is a really cool guy. Man, there's so much back there on him I've never heard. And that really is where we are today, is we tend to get, out of 250 or so founding fathers, we tend to get names from 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8. Does that mean the other 240 weren't significant? No, they were. We've just decided to choose winners and losers today in history, and we don't want to tell you about some of these guys because the ones we want to talk about, are the guys that we think have trouble with faith or morals, or they were pro-slavery. So let's talk about them, and that way we can tear down America. And that's basically the founders we know about. It's all these other guys that don't really have any blemishes to speak of that we never talk about, and they are really significant guys. And so
that had significant impact. I mean, those things you listed about Sherman, it's like, I mean, it's hard to name somebody that had as much of an impact on so many different areas.
Well, there's a professor, Dr. Mark Hall, and he's up at George Fox University in Oregon. He's a great guy. I know Mark, and we've collaborated on projects, and he's just a really good guy and has done some really great stuff on this. And he actually wrote a book on James Wilson, of all people. Imagine that. And he actually wrote a book on Roger Sherman, and we'll have him talk about that book today. But he's also the one who's gone after. There's a lot of guys like out on the West Coast. There's a guy named Greg Fraser who says, well, basically the founders weren't very religious and whatever. And Mark is the guy who debates him. Here's a Christian professor saying that the founding fathers weren't very Christian, and Mark says, no. You're picking out the 2 or 3 or 4. Let's talk about all these others. And so Mark has done such a great job of picking out what we would call lesser lights who really were greater lights in their generation. And so today he gets to tell us some stuff about Roger Sherman, which will be a lot of fun. And this is a founding father every American should know about today. Every American knew about him in his generation for generations afterwards. But it's time to get reacquainted with Roger Sherman.
The book is called Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic by Mark David Hall. Professor Hall will be our guest when we return here on WallBuilders Live.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Although education has remained an emphasis in America for nearly 200 years, what has changed the most over that period of time is the philosophy of education. For example, while religion finds no place of refuge in our schools today, such was not the case at the time of our founding fathers. In fact, when the Delaware Indian chiefs brought their youth to be trained in America's schools, on June the 12th, 1779, George Washington told them, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and our way of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention." According to George Washington, what students learned above all in American education at the time of the Founding Fathers was the religion of Jesus Christ.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. Thanks for staying with us. Our guest today is the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics at George Fox University. Professor Mark David Hall is with us. Professor Hall, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
The book is called Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic. And Professor Hall, first question I have is why Roger Sherman, all the different founding fathers, what made you zero in on him?
One of the problems in a lot of the scholarship that's out there is time and time again, scholars turn to the very most important and the most interesting of the founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. But there's, as you know, lots of other founders that were actually very influential or important. Roger Sherman is one of those. He was critically important in the American founding era, and he's been largely overlooked by scholars, and he turns out to have been an excellent Orthodox Christian. And so I think that Christians ought to know more about people like Sherman.
He's one of those guys that most people know nothing about. I mean, they recognize when you look at the signing of the Declaration painting, you see those guys up front that were on the committee to draft, but they'll recognize Adams, but they don't recognize Roger Sherman. Nobody seems to talk about him much. Why has he kind of been forgotten when he's played such a pivotal role? I mean, you talk even at the beginning of the book about, he signed, those 5 incredible documents that made us who we are as a nation, but only got to do that. But, man, he's kind of been left out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the penny you refer to, of course, he's one of on the 5-man committee that put the Declaration of Independence together. He was critically important in the Constitutional Convention as well, and he played essential roles in the first Federal Congress. So he wasn't just there signing things; he was an active member. I think one of the main reasons, maybe there's a couple, the Founding Fathers we tend to remember, with the exception of 1 or 2, all became President of the United States, right? Washington, yeah. Adams, Jefferson, Madison. they tended to be somewhat younger men, and so they were able to live into the new republic and serve in these prominent ways. Roger Sherman died relatively early in our nation's history in 1793. So he, one of the older founders, played all these very, very important roles, and yet didn't go on to serve in this very prominent way as president. I think that's one reason. I think another reason, the founders we tend to know left lots and lots of papers with which scholars can work. Sherman did not leave that many papers. He was too busy being a husband and father and state legislator and working at the national level, and he wasn't really concerned with his future fame like some of the founders, like Thomas Jefferson was. And the third reason I would give is I think scholars, particularly scholars in the academy, tend to be drawn to people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who were more influenced by the Enlightenment, and certainly, at least later in life, became less than Orthodox Christians, where someone like Sherman doesn't really fit that mold at all. He's a solidly Christian statesman person, a solidly Christian thinker, and so that's somewhat off-putting, I think, to modern scholars.
Yeah, you make a great case for the fact, in the book, you make a great case for the fact that most scholars today seem to key in on these 4 or 5 guys that will fit that, or at least they can use some of their things to fit an Enlightenment way of thinking and not so steeped in religion. And you show how Sherman really represents a greater number of founders and how much he was influenced by the Reformation and how much Calvinism influenced him.
That is a major argument in the book. Something like up to at least 50%, maybe 75% of Americans in this era are reasonably classified as Calvinist. Sherman is a great example of a Calvinist thinker. You think about the founders that we tend to know, Washington and Madison, a Jefferson, a Hamilton, they're all Anglicans. It's a very different stripe of Christianity in the American founder. I think sometimes scholars overemphasize the extent to which some of these guys weren't Christians. But nonetheless, even if we stipulate that this is the case, these Calvinist founders are just simply neglected. About the only one we pay any attention to is John Adams, and of course later in life he became less than an excellent Calvinist. Let's put it that way.
All right, one other thing I really enjoyed, you used the words of other founders to describe him early in the book, and it was amazing how much respect they had for him. They seemed to really revere his mind and his intellect.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. John Adams says some great things about him, Oliver Ellsworth, a number of founders. Yeah, I think everyone respected Sherman, even his enemies respected him. One of them, with respect to the Constitutional Convention, says trying to put Sherman in a corner is trying to grab an eel by the tail. It's just a very clever rascal that got a lot of. He won. He tended to win. He might not have been as flashy as many of the founders, but he put his stamp on all of these documents and laws that, today we revere: the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, intimately involved.
Well, you mentioned he wasn't flashy. One of the things I had no idea, I didn't know this at all. I guess I always thought of all these guys, if they were there as delegates or they were as involved, that we would recognize them as founding fathers, that they had to have been good at oratory back then, because that was it. That was how they influenced each other. But you point out, not him. He was a great thinker and great at influencing these things, but he really kind of fumbled when it came to public speech. It wasn't where he was at his best.
No, that's exactly right. That was probably his greatest weakness that I've been able to find.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, what's the most important thing you would want people to know, if there's only one thing they could take and learn about Roger Sherman, what would it be?
Oh, boy, that's a really hard...
That's not fair, is it? That's why you wrote a whole book about him, because you didn't want it to be just one thing. So it's totally unfair for me to do that. But
I think here's how I'll answer the question, though. I think time and time again, when jurists want to explain what the First Amendment means, they go to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and just a couple of letters or texts that they penned, things like the letter to the Danbury Baptist and the detached memorandum, that do seem to embrace a greater separation of church and state. Roger Sherman did not. He was very comfortable having the state be involved in encouraging Christianity, encouraging morality. He is not an advocate of separation of church and state. One of the reasons this is important is if we're looking for the actual intent of the American founders, is just, in my mind, ludicrous that we keep going to Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't even involved in drafting the First Amendment, and we completely ignore someone like Roger Sherman, who was intimately involved in putting together the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights altogether. And it's not just Sherman. There's others as well, Elias Boudinot, Oliver Ellsworth, and so forth, that really had no patience with this notion of a wall of separation between church and state. And so if we want to actually understand the meaning of the First Amendment, we have to go to people like Sherman and Ellsworth and Boudinot and John Jay and John Adams, George Washington, this whole other range of important and influential founders.
I wonder, Professor, if we gotten almost lazy, kind of, we take the shortcut. We just keep going back to the well of those 3 or 4 or 5 guys we know, and don't dive into folks like Sherman. We're not as scholarly, I guess. It's one of the reasons I love the fact that you picked him and did such an in-depth work on him. But is that part of our problem? We're just not willing to do the hard work of actually researching these topics thoroughly when they're such important topics.
I think that's right. And I think when Supreme Court justices do this, I think oftentimes they're being agenda-driven. They want to find a strict separation of church and state, and so there's 3 or 4 documents they can go to. And these documents don't even necessarily represent the founders' views. Thomas Jefferson famously, after he wrote his letter to the Danbury Baptist, I think it was the next day, maybe 2 days later, went to church services in the U.S. Capitol building, where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister and himself an opponent of religious establishments, preach. And so I think even with respect to Thomas Jefferson, he didn't embrace a sort of strict separation of church and state.
Certainly not the way it's been interpreted.
No,
otherwise
not at all.
He would have been violating his own letter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's right. And so looking at Sherman makes that point all the more real and all the more clear. And Sherman, like Jefferson, oftentimes Jefferson's credited because he wrote this Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. Sherman wrote a very similar text for Connecticut, and there's no real reason to believe that we should privilege the Virginia Statute over Sherman's text. It just has worked well for jurists who want to find a strict separation of church and state.
Yeah, that's a great point. You even point out in the book how it was something like over 100 times that the justices point directly to Jefferson, distinct references to him on the First Amendment when he wasn't there, and yet they've only mentioned Sherman a couple times.
Right. No, that's absolutely right.
Out of all those cases.
Sure, and of course the conservative justices, Scalia, Thomas, Rehnquist, when he was on the court, do a much better job of this. They might not have referenced Sherman that many times, but they do understand there was this constellation of founders out there who very much supported religious liberty, but they didn't think it was necessary to have a wall of separation between church and state in order to achieve religious liberty.
I mentioned that the lack of public speaking skills and oratory skills was what surprised me the most. What surprised you in doing your homework on him and researching him? What was the one thing that you were surprised to find out about him?
Oh, that's a great question. I think probably the theological sophistication. Sherman, as you know, didn't go to college, so he was a bit of a outlier, at least compared with the prominent founders that we tend to know. And yet his pastor was Jonathan Edwards, Jr., son of the great revivalist and theologian. I came across some letters where he engaged in some very, very sort of technical theological debates with Samuel Hopkins. In some of his private letters, again, he was very interested and concerned with theology. Fortunately, his estate had a list of the books that he owned, and he had plenty, as you might imagine, books, on biblical commentaries and Bibles and so forth. But he also had a number of works that are sort of straightforward, dense theology. So this man was a godly man, a pious man, and a very theologically astute man. So yeah, that did surprise me, I have to say.
And sounds like basically self-taught in those fields.
No, that's exactly right. Self-taught.
That kind of gives us hope today. I mean, when you think about, we realize we're not, at least we don't seem to be turning out the great thinkers that the founding era had, and that their education system turned out. But it means if somebody's listening today and they're 35, 40, 60 years old, whatever their age is, and they're hungry to learn more, boy, it's easier for us today. Everything's at our fingertips to go learn this information. Roger Sherman did it in a much more difficult time to get your hands on that kind of information and people that could mentor you and teach you. We can do the same thing he did. It's easier for us to do it today.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. A lot of great resources available, and probably a lot of us have a lot more time than he did. Again, he was working multiple jobs, trying to be a good husband and father, working simultaneously, back then, for most of his career, he served as both a state official in Connecticut and in a variety of national offices. Yeah, so as busy as all of us are, we probably are not as busy as he was.
Well, great place to start on that knowledge and that information and learning. Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic. Professor Mark David Hall, great job, sir. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing it with us. Where do you recommend folks go to get the book?
You can go to the Oxford University Press website and get it there, or probably Amazon. It's just as good a place to go as any.
All right, we'll have links to both of those sites today on our website at wallbuilderslive.com. Professor Hall, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, thank you very much, Rick. Have a good day.
Back in a moment with David Barton. Have you noticed the vacuum of leadership in America? We're looking around for leaders of principle to step up, and too often, no one is there. God is raising up a generation of young leaders with a passion for impacting the world around them. They're crying out for the mentorship and leadership training they need. Patriot Academy was created to meet that need. Patriot Academy graduates now serve in state capitals around America, in the halls of Congress, in business, in the film industry, in the pulpit, and every area of the culture. They're leading effectively and impacting the world around them. Patriot Academy is now expanding across the nation, and now's your chance to experience this life-changing week that trains champions to change the world. Visit patriotacademy.com for dates and locations. Our core program is still for young leaders 16 to 25 years old, but we also now have a citizen track for adults. So visit the website today to learn more. Help us fill the void of leadership in America. Join us in training champions to change the world at patriotacademy.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Thanks to Professor Mark Hall and sharing with us, but also taking the time to study on such a great founding father that really needs to be in our consciousness. We need to be thinking about this guy and going to him for opinions about some of the issues of the day. It sounds like Roger Sherman had as much impact as anyone, and maybe because he was so strong in his faith, and because that was such a big influence on his political positions, maybe that's part of why he's been ignored.
Yeah, because, again, like I mentioned earlier, the founding fathers we tend to talk about today are those who it is alleged that they had trouble with faith or morals, or they were pro-slavery or whatever. And so we tend to choose those guys out, and therefore we can show the flaws of all the founding fathers. But as Mark pointed out, the Calvinist founders really are often neglected. And these are the guys who are really strong in their faith, dedicated to their faith. Their faith drove so much of what they did, including with Roger Sherman. And we don't hear about them. And I love the phrase, I don't think I'd heard this phrase before, but Mark said, he said there's this constellation of founders out there. And I instantly thought of constellation, like stars. Oh, yeah, a constellation is made up of a whole bunch of different stars. It's not just 2 or 3 stars in the sky. Each constellation has several, and that's a good way to consider the founders. They made this constellation, and a constellation is not just made of a George Washington and Ben Franklin. There's a bunch of stars that made that thing up, and there really are in this case. I mean, the Roger Shermans and the John Witherspoons and the Benjamin Rushes and all these others. And so I love that phrase, a constellation of founders that are out there. And what Mark did was such a good job of letting us know, these guys were humans. I think because we venerate them and look at them and their founding fathers, we do forget that they had their enemies. There were people in their day who really disliked them. But even at that, I love the phrase they used where, that critic said, well, trying to put Sherman in corners like trying to catch an eel by his tail.
Yeah, that was great.
And you go, yeah, Sherman was a really smart guy. He's self-taught, but he was really a smart guy. And that just kind of reminds you, yeah, they did have a lot of opposition in their day, and they did take a beating from opponents. And, we look back at them now, and obviously all the good overcomes all the bad. They were human. They had flaws, and their critics certainly pointed those out. But as it turns out, their flaws weren't that big, and they weren't that big a deal, and they weren't debilitating flaws, incapacitating flaws. You can have a difference of agreement of opinion on whatever. And by the way, those letters that Mark talked about with Samuel Hopkins, we have those actual letters, and they are phenomenal to read. And here you have this self-taught guy, and I guarantee you what he is talking about in the way of theology is a lot deeper than what most triple PhDs today in theology would be able to understand. They are fascinating letters to read.
And he must have been great at handling that opposition. I mean, for Jefferson to say that he was a man who never said a foolish thing in his life.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good compliment. And then there was another one he had in the book about, I think it was John Adams that talked about his speech. No, it wasn't Adams. It was Fisher Ames. Fisher Ames said that if he ever got there late for a debate, if he'd been outside while they were debating, it was time to vote, and he'd come in, that he always felt safe in voting as Mr. Sherman did, for he always voted right.
Oh, wow.
That's a pretty good compliment. You know, and I remember when I was a legislator, it was like sometimes you'd be working on another issue or have to go do something. You come back and they're voting. Well, who's that guy? Who's that girl? Who's the person that you really trust to have good judgment, that you would look up and see how they voted and trust to cast your vote, because you're not sure what's actually taking place, and people might be scared to know that happens, but that's how it works. But he was that guy that Fisher Ames said, this guy always voted right.
Man, what an epitaph on your tombstone. He always voted right.
Yeah.
And that's great. But that's the way Roger Sherman was. And I really do encourage folks to get this book. Read this book by Mark Hall on Roger Sherman. Go back and get his other book on James Wilson. Mark does a really, really, really good job. He's one of the good academics out there, not one of the liberal, left, progressive guys. He's really good, and this is a good book and well worth reading. We'll
have a link today at WallBuildersLive.com to make it easy for you. It's called Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic by Professor Mark David Hall. Thanks for listening today to WallBuilders Live.
We stand under